Greenland at the center of tensions between the U.S. and its European allies, and what's widely seen as one of the most serious crises in transatlantic relations for decades.
EU leaders are reportedly discussing plans to deploy $107 billion worth of countermeasures after U.S. President Donald Trump vowed to impose up to 25% tariffs on European goods. And that's unless the U.S. is allowed to acquire the Danish autonomous territory.
And Mr. Trump is pushing to annex Greenland, which he says is critical to U.S. security in the face of risks from Russia and China. Now, for more insight, let's speak now with Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow at Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. I want to start with how Trump's proposed tariffs would actually work. And if they do go ahead, what would be the economic consequences for both sides and for the recently concluded U.S.-EU trade deal?
Well, I think we're at a break point of sorts here, in the sense that relations between the United States and Europe during the Trump administration have been troubled, but they have also been somewhat on an even keel, with the Europeans trying to keep Trump on side, working with him on NATO, working with him on Ukraine. But now you have the American president actually resorting to coercive diplomacy, the threat of tariffs starting on February 1, going higher on June 1, for the purpose of annexing territory that belongs to a NATO ally. This is really a red line that has been crossed here. That's why I think you're seeing Europe convene today in this emergency summit in Brussels and prepare potential retaliatory tariffs. I don't think Europe has a choice, because they need to say to Donald Trump, no, it is not acceptable to threaten to take by force the territory of a NATO ally. If you go down the road of tariffs, we're going to have to play hardball and hit you with retaliatory response that could potentially put the U.S. and the EU in the realm of a trade war.
Well, the French President Emmanuel Macron, who has gone to great lengths to forge a personal relationship even with Donald Trump, he's going as far as to urge activation of the EU's anti-coercion trade instrument in response to these tariff threats, the ACI, or the trade bazooka. How effective would that diplomatic tool be, and could it shift leverage back towards EU capitals in their negotiations now over Arctic security?
Well, I think the Europeans have done a pretty good job of trying to work with Trump. And Trump has built good relationships with Macron, with Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, with Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, with Alexander Stubb, the President of Finland, with Chancellor Merz of Germany. And they may now be able to, in some ways, deploy the leverage that they have with Trump and try to work with him to back him down from these tariffs. But the Europeans are discussing various kinds of retaliatory responses, either increasing tariffs against particular kinds of goods. You mentioned what's called the bazooka, which is an even more forceful retaliatory response. At this point, I think what we're seeing is kind of tit-for-tat posturing. Trump saying, I'm going to hit you with tariffs. The Europeans saying, don't go there, because if you do, we're going to hit you back. I think we're in a very critical period here, February 1, the deadline, where both sides are going to be posturing, and hopefully both sides will take a deep breath and avoid what appears to be a very, very serious rift between the United States and its allies in Europe.
All right, so Professor, if trade war is where this standoff is going to head towards, what would count as a win for Trump, who recently described conquering Greenland as psychologically important?
Well, what is so strange about this whole issue is that everything that Trump wants, he can get. There's a 1951 agreement with Greenland, cut in the early stages of the Cold War, that basically gives the United States access to bases. The United States has a space base already. If it wants to deploy a missile defense, more radar, more naval vessels, if it wants American mining companies to go to Greenland, all of this is possible. And so exactly what it is that is motivating him to go for ownership and acquisition, it's hard to say. Maybe he's looking back to the 19th century and manifest destiny. And he wants, as part of his presidential legacy, to be that he dramatically expanded the territory of the United States. It's just plain difficult to figure out what is motivating Trump here. But I think you're seeing these tariffs and the retaliatory response from the EU, because Trump has actually said, if I can't get it the easy way, I'm going to get it the hard way. Well, what does that mean? The potential use of military force. What does that mean? Potential armed conflict between the United States and its NATO allies. That's in the realm of the unthinkable. And that's why we are now in this stage in which both sides are posturing, and hopefully we can find a way to de-escalate.
You earlier touched on Greenland and tariff standoff having an impact on the transatlantic alliance, Professor. Could this create strategic openings or an opportunity for rivals like Russia or China?
Well, in some ways, I think the narrative that Russia and China like what Trump is doing in Venezuela, what he's doing in Greenland, is a confirmation of great power spheres of influence. That may be true, but I think the main reason that Putin and Xi Jinping may be happy about what's happening is because it creates division, because it creates chaos, because it creates political weakness within the United States and between the United States and its democratic allies. And this infighting creates openings for Russia and China, and it creates footholds for the Russians and the Chinese to manipulate domestic politics here, right? This is a very divisive issue here in the United States. You're actually seeing quite a few Republican members of Congress standing up and saying, hey, Mr. Trump, what are you doing here? It doesn't make sense for the United States to threaten a democratic ally. This kind of political turmoil, this kind of fracturing within the United States is a field day for Russia and China.
So how much of what President Trump is saying, tying, the need for Greenland to national security of the United States, is this about building a midterm narrative for himself and his party? What does Greenland symbolize for his political brand this year?
We can only speculate what's going on here. I think several kinds of impulses are in play. One is Trump's probably feeling emboldened by the successful capture of Maduro, a pretty impressive military operation. I think he's feeling emboldened by the airstrikes on Iran. And now you have Iran in a very difficult political situation, even though the protests have died down. People are talking about the end of the Islamic Republic. He's carried out other airstrikes in the Middle East and Africa. So this could be Trump feeling that this is a time in which he wants to kind of push out and use American power in an assertive way. Trump is also in more difficult position here domestically. His poll numbers are dropping. The tariffs are causing an affordability crisis. Republicans are starting to break with the president. Maybe he's using international politics and foreign policy as a way of trying to rally Americans behind him. And finally, I think you're right to talk about legacy. Trump talked about, quote unquote, manifest destiny in his second inaugural address. He may be looking for his place in history as the American president who finally brought Greenland into the fold. It was in 1867 when the Secretary of State, William Seward, first started talking about annexing Greenland. Maybe what he's looking to do is to say, hey, I finally accomplished this goal that dates back to the 19th century. But in the 19th century, this kind of imperial expansion may have been legitimate and acceptable. It's not legitimate or acceptable in the 21st century.
Thank you so much for wrapping all of that up for us this Monday morning on CNA. Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow, Counsel on Foreign Relations.